The year was 1916. In the chalky fields of northern France, where the Somme River curved through farmland and poppy-strewn meadows, a transformation was underway. One not of progress, but preparation for death on an industrial scale. By June, the British Army, under the command of General Sir Douglas Haig, had been massing men, guns, and ammunition for what was planned as the grand breakthrough of the Western Front. The French, battered and bleeding at Verdun since February, needed relief. The British would deliver it, not through maneuver or cunning, but through overwhelming firepower. The theory was simple and horrifying: bury the enemy under shells, and then walk over the corpses. So began the Week of Thunder. From June 24th to June 30th, more than 1,500 British guns, field pieces, heavy howitzers, and newly arrived siege batteries fired continuously day and night. In total, over 1.5 million shells screamed across no man's land and slammed into the German lines. Locals called it the Week of Suffering. To the German defenders, it was as if the sky itself had collapsed. Trees disappeared. Roads vanished. Trenches became craters, and villages like Fricourt and Mametz turned to ash. The sound could be heard across the English Channel. In London, windows rattled. In Flanders, the ground shook. But not all shells exploded. Thousands were duds, poorly manufactured or degraded by time. Many struck empty earth or bounced uselessly. Worse, the wire, the barbed labyrinth guarding German positions, remained largely intact. And the deep dugouts the Germans had built, reinforced with timber and concrete, absorbed much of the impact. German soldiers, hunkered 30 feet underground, waited. They counted the shell bursts. They passed whiskey. They checked their rifles. Above them, the British command believed annihilation had been achieved. General Rawlinson, overseeing the Fourth Army, was confident the enemy was broken. Reports flowed back to Haig. The wire was cut, the trenches destroyed, the defenders demoralized. The plan called for an infantry assault on July 1st. No quick rush. No rolling barrage. Just a steady, ordered advance across no man's land, like a drill parade into silence. Behind the lines, British soldiers waited, stacked in trenches, packed shoulder to shoulder with kit and rifle. Many had never seen battle. Young men from Lancashire, London, Ulster, and Wales, PALS battalions formed in the patriotic wave of 1914, now grim-faced beneath steel helmets. Some wrote letters. Others smoked. Rumors spread. The German line is dust, you'll walk right in. But a few veterans, the ones who'd seen Ypres, who knew what shellfire could, and couldn't, do, weren't so sure. They'd seen wires shrug off explosions. They'd seen bunkers hold. They'd watched men vanish under machine gun bursts. And they looked across the churned moonscape of no man's land and wondered, what if they're still there? Rain had fallen during the week. The soft chalk of the Somme turned slick underfoot. Craters filled with water. The air stank of powder and decay. In some sectors, the ground literally smoked from the heat of constant shell bursts. British engineers tried to lay communication cables forward under cover of darkness, but many were cut by counter-battery fire. The Germans, though bruised, were not blind. Their own artillery, dispersed and hidden, remained active. By June 30th, the bombardment reached its crescendo, 250,000 shells in a single day. Commanders declared it the final blow. The ground was more crater than earth, yet still the wire stood. Still the bunkers held. And still, beneath it all, German machine gunners sat in darkness, fingers on triggers, waiting for the whistle at dawn. The light was pale, uncertain, creeping slowly across the shattered fields of Picardy. It was July 1st, 1916. At precisely 7:20 a.m., in certain sectors along the 18-mile front, British engineers detonated a series of massive underground mines. Explosions so violent they hurled tons of earth skyward, creating craters over 60 feet deep and throwing German sentries into the air like ragdolls. One mine, at Hawthorne Ridge near Beaumont Hamel, blew seconds before the official assault began. Instead of catching the defenders by surprise, it served as a signal. The attack was imminent. And then came the sound, the long, shrill wail of a whistle. Officers up and down the line raised their pistols. NCOs barked orders. And the men of the British infantry, over 100,000 strong, climbed out of their trenches and advanced into the killing ground. They did not charge. Most were ordered to walk. Weighted down with 70 pounds of gear, rifle, ammunition, rations, wire cutters, gas mask, spade, and water can, many moved slowly, deliberately across the open land. It had been rehearsed for weeks. They moved in waves, stretched in long lines shoulder to shoulder, heads down, bayonets fixed, eyes set on the shattered ridge ahead. No man's land, though bombarded for days, was not empty. It was littered with debris, shattered tree trunks, twisted metal, the corpses of earlier patrols. Here and there, great craters made movement slow. Men tripped. Men slipped. Some fell and rose again. Others vanished, torn by hidden shells. From their lines, British officers looked on, flares in hand, trying to maintain control. Then the Germans opened fire. It began like a gust of wind, low, fast, rising. Then came the hammering, the harsh mechanical stutter of the Maskenengewehr 08s, German Maxim machine guns, opening up from concealed bunkers and sandbag nests. Whole lines of men were cut down before they'd reached even halfway. The fields rippled with bullets. The sharp crack of Mauser rifles added to the chaos, as German infantry fired from trench edges and saps. British soldiers dropped in rows. Some were hit before they had even cleared the parapet. Others made it 10, 20, 50 yards, only to fall screaming, clutching ruined limbs or spouting blood from shattered torsos. The pace didn't increase. The orders were clear. Keep walking. Don't bunch. Don't run. Stay in line. Officers led from the front, revolvers drawn, many killed in the first minutes. Platoon after platoon vanished into gunfire. The silence of dawn had become a roar of agony. At La Boisselle, the Tyneside Irish surged forward and were shredded within minutes. At Thiepval, the 36th Ulster Division managed to storm the German front line, but they were isolated, unsupported, and eventually pushed back by counterattacks. On the slopes near Sarah, the Accrington Pals, boys from the same Lancashire towns, fell so thickly that by 9 a.m., barely a company remained alive. Everywhere along the line, similar scenes played out. Men caught in tangled wire, struggling to cut it while bullets snapped around them. Others slipped into shell holes for cover, only to be killed by shrapnel seconds later. Communications broke down. Field telephones were dead. Runners were killed trying to deliver messages. Orders stalled. Chaos spread. In some sectors, battalions never even reached the enemy trenches. In others, small groups broke through, only to find themselves alone, outflanked, and forced to retreat. By 10 a.m., senior British commanders realized something was wrong. Reports were fragmentary, but clear enough. Casualties were catastrophic. Progress was minimal. At divisional HQs, stunned silence reigned. Should they halt the attack? Reinforce the slaughter? Haig, far behind the lines, believed success was still possible. His belief in attrition, in wearing down the enemy, drove him forward. More waves were ordered up. More men left the trenches. More fell. The battlefield was a graveyard. The hot sun rose higher. Wounded men screamed for help. Some crawled back, dragging themselves through wire and blood, limbs dangling, faces burned from exploding shells. Others lay still, eyes wide, waiting for stretcher-bearers who would never come. The ground steamed. Rats darted between corpses. A mist of gun smoke and dust clung to the shattered landscape. By mid-afternoon, it was clear. The attack had failed. In most sectors, the German line held. Here and there, gains of a few hundred yards were made, but at horrific cost. The British had lost nearly 60,000 men, 20,000 of them dead. It was the single bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. Entire battalions ceased to exist. Company rolls read nothing but silence. And yet, orders came down. The offensive would continue. Tomorrow. The next day. For weeks. On the evening of July 1st, the survivors crawled back to the trenches. Many didn't speak. Others vomited. Some simply wept. Letters home were brief and strange. There was no glory, no triumph, only disbelief. Behind them, no man's land was strewn with the bodies of friends and brothers, men they'd grown up with, trained with, joked with. Now gone. And the guns did not stop. The second day brought no respite, nor did the third. As July unfolded, the British High Command doubled down. What had been intended as a swift and decisive breakthrough along the Somme had now become something different. Something darker, colder, stripped of illusions. It became a war of persistence. The cost of July 1st was already known. Nearly 60,000 casualties in a single day, 20,000 dead before breakfast. But those numbers were not deterrents. They were fuel. Haig, committed to the logic of attrition, believed that the German army had to be worn down, and if tens of thousands of British lives were the price, then so be it. The artillery continued. Not in the same overwhelming barrages as before July 1st, but in concentrated bursts, carefully coordinated to soften German positions in small sectors. Yet even this, the most advanced military minds were learning, could not guarantee success. The Germans had adapted. Their dugouts were deeper than expected. Their trench lines were reinforced, cunningly built with interlocking fields of fire, supported by barbed wire more extensive than any British reconnaissance had shown. The British troops returning to the line, now veterans after just a single dawn of combat, no longer moved with the blind confidence of their initial advance. Their eyes were duller, their steps slower. They no longer expected the wire to be cut or the trenches to be empty. They knew now what was waiting: machine guns, hidden snipers, mortar fire, and the smell, always the smell, of unburied bodies rotting in the summer heat. No man's land, where the attack would happen again, was now a place of human remains and smoking craters. The promise of surprise had been lost. The Germans were prepared. They understood the British method now. Preliminary bombardment, creeping artillery, then waves of infantry. They adapted. They waited. German officers issued precise instructions. Remain underground during the shelling, then reoccupy firing positions the moment the guns lifted. Their Maxim machine guns were never far. Water-cooled, belt-fed, they were reliable and deadly, operated by teams who had learned how to use short bursts, overlapping fields, and enfilading fire to cut down hundreds with a single belt of ammunition. Throughout July, the British made attacks at places with names that would become infamous: Mametz Wood, Contalmaison, Ovelers, Bazentin Ridge. Each had its own horror. Mametz became a forest of shattered trunks and unburied corpses. The undergrowth blasted into nothing. The German defenders entrenched in dugouts that had withstood 5 days of shellfire. The Welsh division attacked there, losing thousands to a single failed assault. At Contalmaison, narrow communication trenches clogged with the wounded prevented reinforcements from reaching the front line in time. At Ovelers, men charged over open ground with no cover, under direct fire from well-concealed machine gun nests. And always the wire. The barbed wire, twisted into knots, often invisible from a distance, was rarely cut effectively by the artillery. Infantry units found themselves trapped before it, tangled while German bullets found their backs. Men fell in clumps. Others tried to throw themselves flat and crawl under, scraping skin and uniforms on the rusted barbs, praying they would not be hit. Some lay there for hours, wounded, crying out for help that never came, only to die under the sun, their bodies slowly swelling in the heat. In some places, the dead could not be retrieved. Their remains became landmarks. That corporal near the smashed tree. The man with no hands near the old trench line. They were never buried. They simply became part of the landscape. July became a month of reports and excuses. Officers tried to explain why attacks failed. Faulty maps, poor communication, mistimed artillery support, inaccurate intelligence. They were not wrong, but none of it mattered. Orders continued to arrive. Positions had to be taken. The pressure to relieve the French at Verdun remained. And so battalions were rotated forward again and again. The men knew what was happening. They knew they were being spent. Morale cracked in places, but discipline held barely. Rumors swirled in the reserve trenches. Entire battalions gone, men shot in the back by their own officers for refusing to advance, others crawling into shell holes and simply refusing to come out. But still, units formed, whistles blew, and men went over. At High Wood, the cavalry was ordered forward, horsemen in 1916, charging through tree stumps and wire and machine gun fire. Most were cut down before they reached the German line. At Longueville, flamethrowers were used for the first time. The screams of the burned echoed through the shattered woods. Artillery shells fell short. Some British shells landed on their own men, obliterating friend and foe alike. In certain sectors, entire company rosters were crossed out in a single day. By the third week of July, the British had pushed forward in some places, no more than 1,000 yards. A mile, perhaps, after 3 weeks of ceaseless fighting and tens of thousands dead. But Haig considered it progress. His officers reported limited objectives achieved. Behind the lines, men staggered back to rest billets, not as soldiers, but as ghosts. Many had lost their voices. Others had not slept in days. Some wept without knowing why. Some never spoke again. And still, replacements came. Fresh battalions arrived, marching in from the rear with clean uniforms, new rifles, eyes filled with cautious hope. They asked questions. They were told little. Only when they reached the front line did they understand. The ground itself was a warning, blackened, cratered, reeking of death. The silence between bombardments was heavier than the noise. And always, the whistle would blow again. It was now late July. The optimism, if ever it truly existed, had rotted. The Battle of the Somme had ceased to be a single offensive. It had become a condition, a permanent environment. Men no longer spoke of breakthroughs. They spoke of sectors, trenches, shell holes. They no longer advanced toward victory. They moved forward by habit, by command, by necessity. Across this mutilated landscape, British soldiers died in ditches and in mud, often without firing a shot. Still, the plan persisted. New offensives were drawn up. Orders were rewritten. Command posts far from the line compiled reports and drew arrows on maps. They planned to take Pozières. Pozières was a village in name only. By the end of July, it was nothing but rubble, ash and broken beams, the skeletons of buildings flattened by weeks of artillery. Yet it mattered. It sat on high ground along the Albert Bapaume Road, one of the few places from which the British could look out over German territory. Haig wanted it, and for this he ordered the Australians. The Australian Imperial Force, veterans of Gallipoli, had arrived on the Western Front weeks earlier. Now they were sent into the maelstrom. At 12:30 a.m. on July 23rd, they advanced into a storm of steel and flame. The shelling was ceaseless. The Germans had massed artillery behind Thiepval Ridge and rained it down with mathematical precision. Men were vaporized in their sleep. Others were buried alive. The Australians clawed their way through what remained of Pozières, storming craters, trench fragments, and piles of stone. They fought hand to hand, bayonet against bayonet, club against helmet. By dawn, they held the village. But that was only the beginning. For the next 48 hours, the German counterattack came in waves. Shellfire smashed the ground to powder. The Australians endured the heaviest bombardment any Allied unit had yet faced. Men went mad. Some fled screaming into no man's land, their ears bleeding, their minds cracked by the relentless pounding. Others simply sat down and refused to move. One observer wrote that the earth itself seemed alive, heaving and breaking like a wounded animal. Reinforcements were sent in. They too were broken. By the end of the Pozières engagement, the Australian 1st Division had lost over 5,000 men in a few days. In August, the Australians returned again to push toward Mackay Farm. Another meaningless ruin, another slaughter. Of the 23,000 Australian casualties on the Somme, the bulk came from those few square miles. Charles Bean, Australia's official war historian, wrote that Pozières was more deeply seared into the nation's memory than any other battle. It was, he said, more deeply sown with Australian sacrifice than any other place on earth. But Pozières was just one piece of the larger puzzle. Elsewhere, the British continued to press forward. At Delville Wood, South African troops were ordered to hold at all costs. They did for 6 days and nights, surrounded on 3 sides, enduring constant bombardment and German assault. Of the 3,000 men who entered the wood, only 750 walked out. The rest lay beneath the trees, or parts of them did. The trees themselves, oak, beech, ash, had been reduced to blackened stumps. Not a single leaf remained. This was the new reality. Villages taken at the cost of thousands, then bombarded into oblivion by both sides. Trenches seized and lost in the same day. Captains who knew they would never return. Privates who aged a lifetime in an hour. The German response grew harsher as well. They began reinforcing with elite units. Bavarian regiments, stormtroopers, fresh artillery. The British found themselves not wearing down the enemy, but matching them blow for blow in an endless exchange of lives. Now came August, and with it, a worsening of the terrain. Rain began to fall, not every day, but often enough. The hard chalk ground became slick. The shell holes filled with water. Wounded men who fell into these pools often drowned before help could reach them. Some were found later, face down in crater water, their legs tangled in wire. Gas attacks returned. Chlorine and phosgene drifted low over the trenches. Masks were worn day and night, and still men choked. The German artillery now used delayed fuses to explode shells below ground, collapsing dugouts with entire squads inside. Burial became a weapon. The dead could not be cleared. They were everywhere, in trench walls, beneath shattered duckboards, frozen mid-crawl in no man's land. Some were used as cover. Others simply became part of the earth. They bled into the mud, and the mud absorbed them. Rats grew bold. They swarmed corpses in daylight. They crept into dugouts, gnawing on bread, fingers, and sleeping faces. Lice infested every uniform. Skin diseases spread. Soldiers itched until they bled. Trench foot returned, blackening toes, stiffening legs. Some men had their boots cut from their feet by orderlies using knives and boiling water. In places like Guillemont and Ginchy, the Irish divisions fought fiercely, advancing through a hell of shattered trees and invisible snipers. The 16th Irish and the 36th Ulster divisions, bitter rivals at home, fought and died side by side in the same poisoned soil. Some commanders remarked that the Somme had done what decades of diplomacy had failed to do. It united Ireland, in blood, if nothing else. Back home, the reality slowly filtered through. Casualty lists filled newspapers. Letters stopped arriving. Women waited for news that never came. Hospitals filled with amputees, the blind, the shattered. Medical boards worked day and night, processing what remained of human beings and sending them to convalescent homes, if they lived. Still, enlistment continued. Posters still went up. The war was not won, not even close. But in the trenches, they no longer spoke of winning. They spoke of surviving, of making it through the next barrage, the next advance, the next hour. The Somme had no front line anymore. Only a broken scar of churned earth, flickering in and out of control, changing hands by the minute, always soaked in blood. And still the orders came. More attacks. More plans. More hope that the next push would break the enemy. But the enemy was not breaking. And neither were the British. They were simply dying. Together. Relentlessly. Quietly. By the first days of September 1916, the fields of the Somme bore no resemblance to France. No nation owned them anymore. They were a kingdom of ruin, without trees, without birds, without color beyond gray and red. The ground no longer smelled of earth, but of iron and rot. So complete was the devastation that even horses, when forced forward with supply carts, sometimes refused to step into the churned remains of what had once been fields, roads, and villages. They knew. The air was different there. Heavier. Sickened. Tainted by weeks of death and chemicals and the disintegration of flesh under sun and shellfire. Haig still believed in the breakthrough. To accomplish it, he approved the deployment of a new weapon, one that had been hidden, tested in secrecy, and kept away from the front until the moment was deemed right. The tank. Officially called landships, these strange machines were steel-clad beasts, powered by engines borrowed from agricultural tractors and clothed in riveted armor plate. They were not designed to inspire confidence. They were loud, slow, and often broke down before reaching the start line. But they were new, and they promised change. On September 15th, during the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, they were unleashed. 49 tanks were assigned to the operation. Only 32 reached the battlefield. Of those, many failed to advance more than a few yards. Tracks snapped. Engines overheated. Some sank into mud before they even saw the enemy. But a handful kept going. They moved forward slowly, belching smoke and grinding over shell holes, crushing barbed wire under their treads and terrifying German soldiers who had never seen anything like them. One German officer wrote that it was as if the devil himself had come in metal. The psychological shock was real. In places, defenders fled before the machines. In others, they stood and fought, using grenades and artillery to disable the lumbering monsters. Tank crews were sealed inside in stifling heat, breathing fumes, deafened by the roar of their own engines and the shells striking their hulls. Some tanks were set ablaze with the crews still inside. Others became steel fortresses, advancing past the infantry they were meant to support. The assault at Flers-Courcelette gained ground, nearly 2 miles in some sectors. High Wood, a name now drenched in misery, was finally taken after weeks of combat. The British captured villages that had been strongpoints for months. It seemed for a moment like something had changed. Haig hailed it as a success. British newspapers wrote of the steel cavalry and hinted at final victory. But within days, the momentum stalled. The tanks could not operate in the deepening mud. Repairs were impossible in the field. The German lines, though pierced, were not broken. They withdrew in good order, fell back to new trenches, and resumed the defense. Artillery thundered. Machine guns rattled. The same slaughter resumed. Now, the tanks were simply another part of the landscape. Charred, broken, half-buried wrecks, their crews entombed inside, never to be retrieved. The infantry followed. Scottish regiments pushed toward Martinpuich. Canadians attacked Courcelette. In each sector, the same story repeated: limited gains, horrific cost. Germans counterattacked with ferocity. Their discipline had not broken. Their reserves, though stretched, were still arriving. Bavarian divisions rotated in to hold key positions. German artillery was now firing with deadly accuracy, using aerial spotting and trench maps marked with precision. Above the battlefield, a new war was raging. The skies over the Somme had become the arena of another kind of duel. One fought in canvas and wood, with engines that rattled and wings that shook. The Royal Flying Corps, tasked with reconnaissance, artillery spotting, and occasional strafing runs, flew flimsy biplanes that often did not survive a week. German Fokkers patrolled aggressively. Dogfights became common. Pilots like Albert Ball and Oswald Bolk began to gain reputations. But life expectancy for airmen was measured in days. Still, aerial reconnaissance changed everything. From above, commanders could finally see the true scope of destruction. Every crater, every broken trench, every shattered road was visible in stark clarity. The photographs told the truth the reports could not. The ground was not simply damaged. It was gone. On that ruined earth, the infantry fought without rest. Their lives were measured not in days or hours, but in minutes. A man might last half an hour at the front before being killed or wounded. Stretcher bearers operated without end, dodging fire, slipping in mud, dragging men back across no man's land under shell fire. Medics worked in dugouts lit by candles, sawing off limbs while rats watched from the corners. Blood pooled in sandbags. Morphine ran dry. And all the while new men arrived. Not volunteers anymore, but conscripts. Young, uncertain, untrained. They arrived by rail in long lines, disembarked, were issued rifles and helmets, and marched to the front. Few understood what awaited them. Some vomited when they saw the trenches. Others tried to laugh. But within hours they would learn. Life in the trenches was not life. It was a form of waiting. Soldiers lived ankle-deep in filth. They slept beside the dead. They ate cold rations and drank from cans tainted by mud. Letters from home arrived and were answered in shivering hands. The smell of decay never left them. Shell shock began to appear in more men. Trembling, blank stares, inability to speak. Some screamed in their sleep. Others had to be tied down. But still, the officers said, "Hold this line. Hold until relieved." They held. September dragged into October. The ground, once firm, became liquid. Rain turned trenches into rivers. Weapons jammed. Boots filled with water. Still they attacked. Every few days, a new order came. Capture this trench, seize that would flank that strong point. Even when success came, at Mackay Farm, at the Schwaben Redoubt, it brought no strategic shift. Just another patch of blasted land where more men would die the next day. And the enemy did not yield. In fact, the Germans responded with fury. They introduced new gas shells, silent and deadly. They launched localized counterattacks with stormtrooper tactics, fast, brutal, coordinated. They shelled British positions day and night, collapsing trenches and burying men alive. Their machine gunners became legends to their comrades, each a reaper behind a steel shield, mowing down waves of men like grass. But the British kept coming. By now, Haig had committed nearly the entire British expeditionary force to the Somme. For armies rotated through the line. Divisions shattered and rebuilt. Some units returned 3 times to the front in 3 months. Few recognized themselves after the second. And still, the line had moved only a few miles. It was enough, they said. Enough to keep going. Enough to push just a little more. They did not know the cost would climb even higher. October brought no relief, only more weight. The kind that broke bones, dulled senses, and turned men into shadows of themselves. The skies over the Somme darkened early and stayed that way. Clouds hung low, pregnant with rain. The wind turned cruel. Sunlight was a memory. The battlefield transformed again, not by shells or fire, but by water. Every step taken by a soldier was now a contest against mud. Not soil, not dirt, but something far worse. Wet clay ground to paste by millions of boots, horse hooves, wheels, and exploding shells. It was adhesive. It swallowed legs up to the knees. It pulled boots off and refused to give them back. Horses that collapsed into it sometimes could not be retrieved before they drowned. Stretcher teams sank to their waists trying to carry the wounded. Rifles jammed from filth. Men slipped and broke ankles. When the cold came, the mud froze, trapping water underneath, turning shell craters into icy graves. The wounded began to vanish into these holes. Hit once, a man might crawl to shelter only to slide into a flooded shell crater. He could scream for hours, his voice carried nowhere, until the water took him. Others simply disappeared. Platoons would finish an attack and realize half their number was gone. Not to bullets, but to the terrain itself. Officers submitted casualty reports that included missing, presumed drowned. Every trench, every forward position, every sap or listening post became a prison. The men were ordered to hold ground they could barely stand upon. Walls collapsed. Duckboards floated away. The water table surged. Latrines overflowed. Rat populations exploded. Some soldiers swore they saw rats larger than cats, grown fat on a diet of human flesh. They feared them more than the Germans. Yet, the orders did not change. The British command now issued regular schedules, new attacks, new objectives. Some trenches had to be taken, others retaken, again and again. At Goodcourt, the Guards Division tried to push forward, supported by tanks which became bogged down after a few yards. At Les Bouffes, the men advanced under sleet. German artillery found them even before they reached their start lines. The barrage that met them was surgical. Whole companies vanished. The few survivors stumbled forward, rifles clogged with filth, into trenches that turned out to be empty, because the Germans had pulled back to higher ground and were now looking down on them. At Eaucourt-l'Abbé, an ancient stone ruin on a low rise, the fighting devolved into a melee inside crumbling walls. Grenades were rolled down stairwells. Bayonets struck stone. One British sergeant recalled seeing a man stabbed through the face, the blade entering at the jaw and exiting near the ear. The only response from command was to reinforce the position with another battalion. Meanwhile, the shelling intensified. The German artillery, guided by superior aerial spotting, blanketed British staging areas with terrifying precision. Trenches were obliterated before men even gathered. Rest billets were hit. Road junctions were cratered. The Germans fired shells laced with gas, or packed with high explosives so dense they created shockwaves strong enough to stop hearts without shrapnel. British guns responded, but the mud slowed ammunition trains. Artillery crews lived knee-deep in slurry, dragging shells by hand when horses failed. Some men collapsed from sheer exhaustion before firing a single round. Communication was nearly impossible. Field telephones were cut by shellfire. Runners were often killed before delivering messages. Flares misfired in the rain. Men attacked without knowing the unit next to them had already failed. They advanced into empty ground, unsupported, only to be encircled and cut down. Officers were left making decisions with hours-old information. Every plan was outdated by the time it reached the front. Then came Trones Wood again. A place already fought over, already flattened. The Germans had returned, and so the British returned as well. It was an ocean of mud dotted with tree stumps, cratered into a gray nothing. Smoke clung to it like gauze. The attack was launched at dusk, under drizzle. Men moved like phantoms. Few made it more than 100 yards. Those who did found themselves alone, surrounded by the dead. The medical services strained under the weight of never-ending injury. Forward aid posts were flooded. Stretchers arrived with men whose legs were already rotting from exposure. Gas cases surged. Wounds became infected within hours. Tetanus, gangrene, septicemia, all common. Nurses in casualty clearing stations worked without pause, soaking blood into their skirts, cutting away skin with unwashed blades. Morphine was scarce. Amputations were done in rows. And still the line crawled forward. Haig remained convinced of progress. Reports were filtered through layers of command, and each one softened the reality. Successes were highlighted, failures buried in footnotes. He believed the Germans were breaking, that their losses were unsustainable. And he was partly right. The Germans were suffering, terribly. But they were not collapsing. They were reinforcing. They were digging new lines. They were holding. Just like the British. Just like the French. By late October, the battlefield had taken on a silence between attacks that was worse than the noise. The absence of gunfire was unnatural. Men waited for it to resume. When it didn't, they felt fear, not relief. In those moments of quiet, the full horror was heard. The cries of wounded trapped in no man's land. The squelch of rats. The bubbling hiss of gas seeping from canisters. The wet coughing of men with trench fever. Every step forward cost lives. Every inch of ground was purchased with the bones of boys from Liverpool, Glasgow, Sydney, Dublin, and Delhi. The Empire had fed the line with its best and brightest, and now those men were being swallowed, absorbed into the Somme. A generation vanished, not in a single day, but minute by minute. Even among the hardened, madness took root. Some men wandered from the trenches at night and simply kept walking, unarmed, into darkness. Others stood still under fire, whispering to themselves. Officers noticed men no longer ducked from shells. When asked why, many responded the same way. What's the point? October ended in rain. And still the next attack was planned. The pale winter light this November morning filtered through ragged clouds, and still, there was no warmth. Only the grinding, bone-deep cold that settled into every trench. It wrapped around the men like chains, pulling at their drums, freezing their breath, crystallizing every drop of sweat and blood. This wasn't just weather. It was another enemy. Forward positions were now buried beneath a crust of ice, beneath which lay sludge so deep that a man could disappear without a trace. Mud froze into hard plates above, concealing pit traps of frozen gore that shattered boots. Each step became a calculation. Will the dirt hold or collapse underfoot, carrying me into a mass grave? Rations hardened. Water cans froze cracked. Firewood was rare. Burning was illegal. Night shelters baked in crusts of ice that men scraped away when they woke, only to sink straight into mire once the thaw came at midday. Officially, the Somme battle had petered. And yet, for the men, there was no pullback. There was no reprieve. The front was static, but only in name. Mines were laid deeper, galleries dug under frozen ground, and fighting became subterranean. British sappers tunneled beneath German lines, planting charges that shook trenches above in midnight tremors, blowing men and earth skyward. The explosions sounded like mountains caving in, but they produced tiny, savage gains. One crater could be held if men could reach it in the cold before the Germans did. Night raids became a routine tactic. Small patrols crept over the frozen wasteland in snowdropped wire, through fields of ice-covered barbs, toward enemy trenches adorned with snow, impossibly white, offering perfect cover for snipers. Fragile winter camouflage, smudged by soot and blood, became masks for men brandishing shovels, bombs, revolvers. They slipped into German listening posts, killed silently, blew portions of trench into the sky, and backed out before daylight. Sometimes they returned with prisoners, sometimes with nothing but frozen limbs and tooth marks in their tongues. Inside the trenches, night threatened madness. Darkness brought silence that beamed the crack of ice settling, the distant groan of frozen wood, the slow drip, urgent, for a moment, like a heartbeat. Men whispered into blankets. They wrapped newspaper around their faces. They tied scarves and socks and lit candles in tin mugs, watching the light tremble. Lice froze solid, then revived with the strange warmth of body heat. Rats slowed, but starvation made them bold again. They chewed through mittens, fur hats, and even leather boots to nibble at ankles. Among the new units sent forward, Canadians, Newfoundlanders, Indian Labor Corps, the winter was a rude shock. Troopers, accustomed to cold but not this kind, looked into landscapes stained white and crimson alike, and their eyes carried something like fear. Letters home ceased. Field post offices struggled amid frozen roads, and for many the only news came in intermittent telegrams, always repeating, "Relief imminent." Relief was always imminent. But every day, new men lined up to go forward. Young men, conscripts. The wooden blocks they stood upon in reserve trenches iced over, making their watch sentries slip and curse. And still the guns didn't rust. Shell factories back home in Britain, their production lines tirelessly humming, delivered more shells. Now with wired-delayed fuses, improved explosives and gas, poisonous winter bouquets of phosgene and chlorine that rolled low as strange fog across the frozen ground. Gas, in the cold, behaved differently. It lingered invisible and deadly, hugging every hollow, every dip. Masks frosted. Eyes watered. Some men died in sleep, their lungs drowning in silence. The frozen Somme demanded ingenuity. Horse-drawn sledges became essential. Pulleys through icy supply paths, cutting 20 minutes into resupply time. Medical teams adapted. Heated tents lined with straw, hot water bottles, but often frozen within minutes. Surgeons worked in sub-zero operating tents. Fingers numb, blades brittle, blood frozen upon contact. Yet they carried on, performing amputations by candlelight, whispering prayers in Latin and English, their words crystallizing in the air. Weather wore on. Frostbite stalked without gunfire. Men awoke with black toes they didn't feel. Feet turned gangrenous. Those able attempted to warm them, plunging bare feet into each other's hands, legs wrapped together in blankets. Some chafed the flesh with brushes, hoping to restore circulation. Others watched their comrades scream at night, soaked sheets heating up with lice and frozen blood. Then silent, dead, and still the orders came. The skeleton remains of divisions, worn like ragged coats, were ordered to hold. Maintain the line at all costs. Relief never arrived. Weather lawyers down march, mud and thaw, ice and freeze. No man's land glistened dangerously, hiding crater pits like tombs. Patrols continued in pairs. If one died, the other could bring the body back. But too often both died, one crushed in ice, the other to bullets. Commanders sent plans. New thrusts to the east, seizing high ground around Beaumont Hamel before winter's end. On paper, they would break the German line as soon as snows turned to mud. Engineers framed makeshift plank roads across frozen quagmires. But when the attack came, it followed the same choreography. Artillery smothered the ground. Infantry in heavy overcoats marched forward, snow fell. Nets of wire, though iced silver, held fast. Machine guns waited. Casualties rose before the men neared halfway. Wire froze. Instead of snapping under shells, it buckled. Men tangled, stayed exposed, became targets. A cache of new weapons, bomb throwers, improved rifles, winter clothing, reached the front, but often too late. They were distributed in sled convoys ripped apart by shellfire. The cold broke men's resolve. They still moved, plank roads creaked, ration parties slid on frozen inclines. Stretcher teams strapped injured to sledges, breathing into them to keep them alive while gliding across ice toward field hospitals that looked like wooden ruins. Doors frozen shut, lanterns flickering dimly inside. Stories emerged. Men carving names into frozen faces with bayonets. Letters shoved into helmets pinned on stakes above graves. Captured Germans trading cigarettes in the trenches and trading the gift of warmth. A British officer who walked into a German trench in winter uniform and didn't move until summoned inside, dead from cold, and only then discovered he'd somehow slept for hours, his frozen breath crystallizing on the wire. Christmas came, the 1916 holiday beyond all others, draped in snow and silence. No truce, no carol, only distant shell whistle, the thud of frozen feet against ladders. Messages sent, we are cold. We miss home. But relief never came. Command orders. More rest shelters, improved drainage, construction of winter dugouts reinforced with corrugated iron and straw. These took days, and by the time they were built, the thaw began. By the first days of January 1917, the men who had endured the Somme were no longer men as they once were. They had been hollowed out by fire and frost, by the slow erosion of sanity and soul. Their uniforms were patched with canvas and mud. Their eyes no longer blinked at the sound of artillery. Their bodies did not flinch when a shell fell nearby. They had lost the reflex to hope, replaced instead by a dull, mechanical endurance, a kind of living inertia. These were not the green boys of 1914 or the fresh volunteers of 1915. These were veterans now, not by medals, but by wounds, some visible, others carried in silence. They bore the names of places not in pride, but in scars. Mametz, Delville Wood, Pozieres, Courcelette, Trones Wood, Thiepval. These weren't battles to them. They were wounds stitched into time, each one a black star carved across the map of their memory. The Somme had become more than a place. It was a machine, a grinding, churning engine of men and metal that never ceased, even as winter gripped it, and its gears were fed daily with blood. Behind the lines, the machine required fuel. Railways built hastily during the summer had to be maintained in winter, cleared of snow and kept running under threat of shellfire and frost heave. Ammunition trains crawled through icy fog, each car a potential coffin. Drivers wore layers of wool and oilskin, breathing clouds as they leaned into frozen throttle levers. Mules pulled limbers over frozen duckboards, hooves wrapped in sacks to prevent slippage. The chain of supply never stopped. It couldn't. Every bullet, every shell, every tin of meat, and every candle had to reach the front. Failure meant death, not by bullet, but by starvation or silence. New drafts of soldiers arrived every week. Some were boys who'd lied about their age. Others were older men, conscripted now under new policies. They came from every corner of the empire: Glasgow, Belfast, Birmingham, Toronto, Lahore, Auckland. They arrived in small stations, disembarked onto platforms soaked with freezing rain, and were marched along duckboard paths toward the reserve trenches. Their breath rose in clouds. Their boots squelched in half-frozen mud. And none of them, not one, understood what waited for them. Those who had survived the previous months recognized them instantly. The clean faces, the stiff postures, the awkward grip on rifles. The new ones asked questions. They joked. They wondered aloud about when the war would end. And the veterans gave them nothing. Not cruelty, but silence. Not because they didn't care, but because they knew. Within days, the laughter would vanish. Within a week, some of the new ones would be missing, buried under collapsed trenches, or found face down in a shell hole, their last breath frozen in mud. January's snow gave way to sleet, then back to snow again. The landscape shifted daily. One morning, it would be white and silent, like a cemetery under frost. The next, brown sludge reemerged, slick and deep, carrying with it the half-rotted limbs of the forgotten dead. Some trenches had walls made entirely from frozen corpses now, stacked with a grim kind of logic. There wasn't time to bury them. There wasn't space. The chaplains still tried to perform rites, whispering Latin over nameless limbs. But most men simply stepped over the dead, or used them as cover. It wasn't callousness. It was survival. Up and down the line, the artillery duels never ceased. British guns, more numerous now, better supplied, fired in rotating shifts. Some batteries kept up a rhythm so constant that crews went deaf within days. Gun crews wrapped scarves around their faces, their hands blistered by the steel of frozen breech handles. They bled into their gloves and kept loading. Ammunition dumps were camouflaged under snow. German observers searched for the telltale puffs of powder smoke, then called in counter-battery fire. The Germans had learned. They responded now with more than just shells. They sent stormtroopers, elite shock units trained in trench raids, infiltration, and psychological warfare. At night, these men crossed no man's land in silence, dressed in black, crawling over frost-hardened wire, slipping past listening posts. They carried clubs, grenades, pistols. When they attacked, it was swift and brutal. Sentries were strangled or stabbed before alarms were raised. Whole dugouts were blown apart before anyone knew the enemy had arrived. British forward positions, often barely held by understrength platoons, responded in kind. Raids went both ways. Night became a time of dread. Men slept in bursts, an hour here, a half hour there, never undressed, always half alert. Patrols were sent out nightly. Some didn't return. Others came back changed, hands shaking, eyes wild. One soldier, after returning from a raid in which his partner was disemboweled by a mine, simply stopped speaking. He was removed the next morning, sobbing silently into his coat. Yet through all of this, the orders kept coming. In the second week of January, Haig ordered new assaults. The Germans had begun a strategic withdrawal from certain exposed salients. British intelligence interpreted this as a sign of collapse. It wasn't. It was consolidation, a retreat to better, more fortified lines. But to Haig, it was confirmation that attrition was working. The Somme had bled the enemy dry. The only thing required now was more pressure. And so the plans were redrawn. The line would push again. At Beaucourt Ridge, at Grand Court, at the remains of Sarah. Once the site of so many deaths on July 1st, the attacks were renewed. Men trudged through waist-deep snow, rifles slung over shoulders like axes, gas masks swinging from belts. The wire was not visible under the snow. Some men ran directly into it. Others fell into old craters filled with ice and drowned in frozen mud. The German positions were ready. Machine guns opened up with ruthless precision. Artillery fire bracketed every path of approach. Still, British units advanced. Some even reached their objectives, only to be forced out hours later when counterattacks rained down. The cycle repeated. Every foot of ground cost lives. Every small victory was written in blood. The generals called it tactical progress. The soldiers called it slaughter. And yet the machine ground on. Behind the front, engineers worked on new innovations. Improved gas delivery systems, deeper dugouts, rotating frontline units on a more efficient schedule. Medical personnel received new stretchers with sled runners. Pigeons were trained for better message delivery. The war had become so immense, so sprawling, that systems had to evolve just to maintain the scale of killing. By the end of January, over 1.2 million shells had fallen on the Somme front in a single month. No land, no creature, no breath of air remained untouched. The trees, what few stumps still stood, had become black claws reaching into the sky. Birds no longer nested. The worms were gone. The earth was poisoned. And the men stayed. In the holes, in the ruins, in the dark. No one knew in those days when the Somme would end, or if it ever would. By early February 1917, the Somme front had become something beyond geography, beyond even warfare. It was no longer a battlefield. It was a crucible, a place that didn't just take men's lives, but reshaped what a man was. Identity, nationality, belief. None of it mattered in the gray mud of that place. You were only a body, a tool, a cog in a mechanism that had long since lost the capacity for anything but destruction. Yet it kept turning. The war machine was tireless. And so were its demands. Reinforcements kept arriving. Not by the thousands anymore, but in smaller, more fractured groups. Men of units already shattered in the earlier waves. Patched-up battalions now filled with strangers wearing the insignia of the dead. It was common to find a platoon commanded by a sub-lieutenant barely 20 years old, leading men he had met only hours before. Trust had to be immediate. There was no time for camaraderie, no time for names. The Somme, after 8 months of continuous bloodletting, had begun to consume even memory. Units that had once been proud regiments with long lineages, Yorkshires, Norfolks, Highlanders, Sherwood Foresters, were now reduced to lists of numbers. 4th Wave, 6th Division, 17th Support Column. The men didn't talk about their home counties anymore. They talked about craters, about distances, about how far they could crawl before the machine guns opened up. The earth had collapsed in on itself. Entire trench networks were no longer usable. Some had vanished altogether, swallowed by shellfire and water. Engineers had stopped trying to build straight lines. They now carved trenches in irregular arcs, wherever the ground could hold. Shelters were dug deeper than ever before, with multiple exits, reinforced ceilings, and wooden bunks stacked 3 high. Yet still, they weren't safe. A direct hit with a heavy shell could pulverize a dugout and everything in it. More than once, men were buried alive by the very earth they tried to shape into shelter. Snow still clung in patches, now gray with soot. Rain followed often. The thaw turned the trenches into lakes. The duckboards floated loose. Men had to wade through knee-high water for hours to reach their positions. It was common for men to arrive with bleeding feet, socks glued to their skin by pus and ice. Trench foot was so widespread that daily inspections became mandatory. Officers were told to enforce changes of socks and greasing of feet. But grease ran short. Clean socks were a fantasy. Frostbite continued to cripple men silently. Many didn't report it. They feared being labeled weak. Others waited too long. By the time they were evacuated, blackened toes had already turned septic. At dressing stations, the orderlies no longer asked questions. They simply cut. There were so many amputations in February that one unit ran out of field bandages and began tearing blankets into strips. Still, the artillery didn't stop. German guns now fired in barrages set to rhythm. Time to coincide with ration deliveries, morning stand-to, and known shift changes. They had memorized the pattern of the British war day. So the British adapted. Rations were delivered at odd hours, sometimes by crawling parties of 2 or 3 men dragging sacks of bread and tinned meat through ditches. Water was worse. Most of it came in cans carried by hand, already fouled with trench mud. Men learned to drink quickly, before the lice floated to the surface. And above them, the air war intensified. The skies over the Somme, once the realm of silent biplanes and daring aces, had become another theater of attrition. Squadrons now flew in formations, not duels. British RE-8s and Sopwith pups patrolled in clusters, watching for the black crosses of Albatros scouts. German planes were better, faster, with synchronized machine guns firing through the propeller. Their pilots were hardened killers. Richthofen's flying circus was now active over parts of the line, and the British suffered losses daily. Observation balloons were shot down with impunity. Entire sections of the front were temporarily blinded. Pilots lived in a different world than the men below, but they shared one thing: short lives. The average expectancy for a new British airman on the Somme was less than 3 weeks. Some never made it to a single combat sortie. Others burned alive in the sky, their planes igniting in sudden flashes of orange above the brown hell below. When they crashed behind enemy lines, their bodies were usually unrecoverable. Yet the push continued. At Miramont and Irles, new objectives were drawn up. The enemy was believed to be withdrawing, and there was a desperate desire to pressure them before they could establish new lines. The weather made movement almost impossible. Infantry units often had to carry their own ladders and bridges to cross water-filled craters. Some platoons moved so slowly that the men advanced for 4 hours to cover a distance of 300 yards. At Irles, a battalion began its attack without realizing its own supporting artillery had not yet fired. They advanced into untouched wire and were slaughtered within minutes. Despite this, small victories were seized and held. The ground, once paid for in blood, was now preserved with equal sacrifice. Men dug into half-sunken trenches and waited for the inevitable response. German counterattacks were swift, methodical. They came not in human waves, but in sharp, coordinated movements. Stormtroopers supported by creeping artillery, grenade squads, and flamethrower teams. British defenders fought with bayonets and pistols in tunnels choked with smoke and screams. The hospitals at Amiens and behind Albert overflowed. Wards were built from scrap wood and canvas. Men lay two to a bed. Infections spread like fire. Nurses wept silently as they cleaned the same wounds again and again, only to see the limbs rot and the faces twist in agony. Gas injuries now outnumbered bullet wounds. Eyes swollen shut, lungs filled with liquid. There were not enough morphine doses. Screams became the nightly soundscape. Yet from all this, still more soldiers came. More trains arrived. More boots marched up the same roads now paved with frozen entrails and broken tools. Fresh uniforms. Fresh rifles. Faces not yet marked by mud. They were told to hold. To stand. To prepare for spring. Because spring, they said, would be the end. They were wrong. March 1917 arrived like a dull drumbeat, gray, wet, and endless. On the surface, the Battle of the Somme had ended 4 months earlier, declared complete by high command. But for the men still living and dying in the sodden trenches, nothing was over. The killing continued with precision. Only the names changed. The ground did not. The horror did not. Orders were still issued, and men still obeyed. The war, relentless and indifferent, simply shifted into a new phase. Haig called it consolidation. The men called it more of the same. The fields of the Somme, what few hadn't been permanently altered by shellfire, now served as stepping stones toward the next campaign. Haig had no intention of letting the momentum slip. His command believed that the Germans were weakening, and they wanted to press the advantage before new lines could be established. Behind German positions, a quiet operation had already begun, one that would soon rewrite the landscape again. The Germans called it Operation Albrecht. As the British prepared to resume their push, the Germans executed a masterful retreat. Not a chaotic withdrawal, but a calculated step backward, abandoning exposed salients and overextended positions to fall back to a newly constructed defensive line, the Hindenburg Line. It was fortified with concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, underground passages, and deep belts of barbed wire. It was shorter, straighter, and infinitely easier to defend. But they did not go quietly. As the Germans withdrew in February and March, they enacted a scorched earth policy. Villages were evacuated, then destroyed. Wells were poisoned. Trees were cut. Roads were mined. Churches were gutted. The ground itself was booby-trapped. Explosives were hidden in doorways, under floorboards, inside walls. Whole buildings collapsed on returning civilians. Where homes had stood, there were now just pits lined with broken glass and mud. They left behind no shelter, no food, no tools, only traps. British and French troops advancing into these vacated sectors were struck not with triumph, but confusion. The silence was eerie. Whole towns were empty. No shots. No shellfire. Only the wind through the ruins. Patrols moved cautiously, bayonets fixed, expecting ambush at every corner. Engineers led the way with probes and listening devices. Yet still, explosions killed dozens each day. Men killed not by enemy soldiers, but by empty houses that had been turned into bombs. At Bapaume, the ruins were so thoroughly mined that it took 2 full weeks before troops could safely establish a command post. Ammunition stores were found rigged to blow. One officer's mess was obliterated when a clock-triggered device detonated. The Germans had weaponized time itself. Their retreat had been silent, but not passive. It was an exercise in cruelty by design. Meanwhile, the Somme sector, what remained of it, had become a ghost front. Fighting continued, but it was scattered, uncertain, confused. Whole divisions were rotated out of the line. Others arrived and began the brutal work of rebuilding trenches that had been swallowed by winter. Shovels broke against frozen ground. Men hacked at old sandbags, tore apart shattered duckboards, and tried to erect new latrines, new fire steps, new dugouts. The work never ended. Medical services tried to stabilize the shattered chain of care. Thousands of cases of trench fever, frostbite, and exposure were now being catalogued. Pneumonia surged. There were men dying in their dugouts without ever being wounded. Lungs flooded by cold and damp, immune systems shattered by months of stress. Shell shock victims became so common that command ordered special treatment stations behind the line. Men were found screaming into blankets. Others couldn't speak at all. Some dug their own graves and sat beside them. Commanders saw all this and made charts. They marked recovery times, replacement rates, unit cohesion. They saw numbers. They saw ratios. They saw reports. But the men beneath those reports, those sitting with lice in their hair and mud on their lips, didn't see anything anymore. They simply waited. For the next shell. For the next whistle. For the next burial. Then came the thaw. In late March, the ground finally gave way. The frost retreated. The moisture, long locked in ice, now surged to the surface. The trenches collapsed. Walls caved in. Latrines overflowed. Weapons rusted in minutes. Ammunition turned soggy. Boots were torn off by suction. The mud returned with a vengeance, deeper and darker than before. Engineers had to invent new methods to move guns forward. Wooden trackways, rolling log mats, mules with sledge frames. Nothing worked well. Everything broke. And still, preparations were underway. The spring offensive was coming. The Somme had to be linked to the new front line near Arras. Supply depots were expanded. Ammunition dumps increased. Medical stations rebuilt. The railway spurs extended. Men were moved again. The names of villages reappeared on maps, though few bore any resemblance to the places they had once been. Some men who had survived the previous year returned. They walked the old paths, Pozières, Thiepval, Longueville, and found nothing. No markers. No memories. Just mud. They stood where their friends had died and realized they couldn't tell one shell hole from another. The land had forgotten them. New units arrived, colonial troops from India, Africa, the Caribbean. Many had never seen France before. They found themselves in a world that looked like the moon. They were issued British uniforms, British rations, British weapons, and told to dig, to build, to serve. Some would see combat. Others would die building roads that would be bombed before completion. By the end of March, Haig finalized his plans. The Germans had given ground, but he believed that further pressure would yield collapse. He was wrong. The Hindenburg Line loomed ahead, invisible for now, but impregnable. Yet the British were ordered forward into the empty towns, across the torn remnants of the Somme, toward a new kind of war. Not the war of breakthroughs, not the war of heroism, but the war of exhaustion, of inches, of blood without end. And the men moved, because they were told to, because they could do nothing else. April 1917 rose over the Somme not like a dawn, but like a curtain pulled over a play that refused to end. The snow had melted, the ground was no longer frozen, but nothing returned to life. No birds sang, no green returned. Even the wind had grown weary. It blew soft now, tired, whispering only to those who still listened. The battlefield remained scarred beyond reason, and the men still stood in their lines, waiting for orders that would come without meaning, because meaning had long since drowned in the mud. The British command, meanwhile, was not waiting. With the Germans pulled back into the steel-thick bastions of the Hindenburg Line, Haig prepared a new offensive to break them. Not on the Somme, though the land was still contested there, but to the north at Arras and soon beyond, in a place called Passchendaele. The Somme had become a backwater, a supply channel, a memory, but not yet a silence. Units were rotated through it still. Work continued. Death did not pause. Those who had served in the Somme's worst months, July, August, September, had not forgotten. They wore it in their gait, in the way their hands never stopped twitching, in the strange quietness that would descend upon them at dusk. And now they were veterans, posted to train others, to lead newer men through shattered sectors that still bore the detritus of catastrophe. Some did this with duty. Others drank. A few broke entirely. The ground itself was no longer stable. Each rainstorm turned the trenches into canals. Entire sections of the line were held by sandbag walls stacked like dams. Pumps choked with silt. Men lived ankle-deep in water, torches hanging above their heads in dugouts where air was thin and always wet. The mud had a memory, it kept the dead. Sometimes, in the right light, a skull would appear in the trench wall, grinning beneath a helmet fused to bone by rust. When the walls collapsed, the bones spilled out like confetti, and the men stepped over them, cursing, too numb for reverence. Every day, work parties went forward, not to fight but to fix. Repair the wire. Rebuild the parapets. Lay duckboards. Clean out sumps. It was punishment by routine. The enemy watched them through periscopes and optical sights. Sometimes they didn't shoot. Other times they did. A single round from a Mauser rifle could kill a man shoveling mud with his back turned. There was no glory in that kind of death, just a short scream and a stretcher pulled back through sludge. The Germans, now settled into their Hindenburg Line, had not abandoned the Somme entirely. They continued to shell the rear areas, harass the working parties, fire at ration runs. In some sectors, they used trench mortars, Minenwerfers, lobbing slow, high-arcing bombs that howled in descent and turned soil to dust. Their gas shells increased too, silent, at first, then a soft hiss, then the screaming. Phosgene, chlorine, diphosgene. Masks helped sometimes, but not always. The filters rotted. The masks didn't fit. The gas found its way into men's lungs, and when it did, it tore them apart from the inside out. The medical corps, already stretched thin, began training gas orderlies. Soldiers tasked with identifying symptoms and administering emergency treatment. But they had no cures. The treatment was oxygen, which was scarce, and rest, which was rarer. Some men were turned away. "He'll live," they said. But then he didn't. Lungs filled with fluid. Death came slowly. The coughing lasted for days, each one bringing up more blood than the last. Farther behind the line, in what was left of villages like Bray-sur-Somme, reserve units lived in shattered houses with collapsed roofs and open wells. The civilians were gone, evacuated or dead, but their ghosts remained. Portraits still hung on soot-black walls. A cradle sat frozen in place in a burned-out bedroom. The soldiers didn't speak about these things. They simply placed their gear in the corner and slept beside whatever remained. It wasn't fear. It was resignation. And yet life continued, grotesque and pitiful. Rats became companions, sometimes pets. One unit trained a rat to run messages along a length of trench, bribed with chocolate and bread. Another raised a piglet found wandering the ruins of a barn, fed it scraps, kept it warm in a dugout. They named it Sergeant, and it was eventually eaten without ceremony when the food ran out. The paperwork never ceased. Every trench, every crater, every barbed wire fence was mapped. Coordinates were updated weekly. Reports were filed for each inch of repair work, each death, each confirmed kill. The bureaucracy of slaughter was meticulous. Even the most meaningless exchange of fire had a record. Men filled out casualty slips for comrades they had known since school. Died of wounds. Presumed buried. Shellfire, body not recovered. Whole companies reduced to ledger entries. Command inspections took place, too. Generals with polished boots and waxed mustaches stepped into the reserve trenches for a few hours, shaking hands, listening to pre-cleared reports. Afterwards, they issued memoranda on morale and discipline. They noted with concern the growing appearance of spiritual fatigue. Orders followed. Increase him singing. Provide more books. Discourage the use of profanity. And for God's sake, rotate the men out before morale collapses. But the rotations didn't come in time. Desertions began, not massed, not open, but slow and quiet. A man who vanished during a latrine break. Another who never returned from carrying rations. A pair who took their rifles and were never seen again. Courts-martial increased. A few executions were carried out. Not on the Somme front, but near it. Enough to remind the men what waited for those who stepped out of line. Religion flickered. Chaplains held services in rain-drenched shelters, reading from psalms drowned out by wind. Some men wept. Others laughed. One chaplain hung himself in a ruined vestry after burying a dozen boys from one platoon in a single day. His replacement arrived the next morning and resumed services without comment. In April's second week, the weather turned again. Warmth returned. The ground dried. For the first time in months, men saw stars at night instead of smoke. Trees, or what was left of them, began to bud barely. The air smelled less of rot. Hopes stirred, faint and foolish. Rumors began. The Americans were coming. The French were planning something. The war would end by Christmas. Or maybe by harvest. No one believed it, but they still said it. And so, the men on the Somme continued their slow, grinding march toward nowhere. They weren't soldiers anymore, not in the old sense. They were tools. They were machines made of meat. They were ghosts walking the corridors of a world that had already died. And they waited for the next whistle, for the next name to be read, for the next shovel of mud to cover the latest corpse laid beneath the rain. Because that was the only order that still made sense. Survive. May 1917 bled into the Somme not with a roar, but with a whisper. It was the month of quiet agony, less defined by great offensives or explosions than by the weight of waiting. The waiting itself became a kind of torture, a weapon of time. The men had been pulled from the center of fury and thrust into its echo, into lines that were no longer exploding but simply rotting. And rot, in the trenches of the Somme, had power. Rot lived in the duckboards, planks once solid now pulping under every footstep. It climbed up sandbags, splitting the seams, growing fungal veins that spread across the parapets like veins beneath sick skin. It infected clothing. Socks wore through faster than they could be replaced. Belts crumbled. Webbing frayed. Men found that even their rifles rusted faster than they could oil them. The air was warm now, and that meant disease. Lice thrived again. Flies returned in clouds. They blanketed the latrines and landed on every open wound. The wounded came in steady streams, not from offensives, but from daily attrition. A shell here, a sniper shot there. Sometimes entire dugouts collapsed from old shell damage, burying their occupants without warning. Mines still lay under certain sectors, forgotten, unstable, waiting. One of them detonated near Bullecourt in the middle of a foggy morning without warning. The ground lifted as if exhaling. A fireball burst from the clay. Over 30 men died in a moment. The crater remained, half filled with murky water, unapproachable due to lingering fumes. Another mark on the map, another number in a report. Mail arrived with less frequency. Rain slowed the lorries. Shellfire interrupted rail lines. But even when it came, the letters brought little joy. Families at home had no understanding of the world the soldiers inhabited. Mothers wrote of spring blooms, of coal shortages, of rationing. Sweethearts wrote of dreams and songs and church bells. It all sounded like fiction. To the men crouched beneath earth and steel, the world beyond the front had become something remembered like a dream from childhood, warm, distant, and unreachable. Entertainment, such as it was, took strange forms. A game of cards played on an ammunition crate. A harmonica passed between hands too dirty to hold food. Some men drew pictures in the dirt with broken bayonets. Others carved faces into bullets. In one sector, a sergeant began reading aloud from Shakespeare each evening by candlelight. Not for morale, not for culture, but because it gave men a reason to sit together without speaking about death. And the dead always were nearby. Some trenches could not be cleaned. In certain flooded communication routes, bodies from previous months still floated, faces bloated and indistinct. They were marked with chalkboards hung from nails. Do not remove. Identified, but the identification meant little. These were ghosts now, reminders of what lay ahead for everyone still breathing. Even dreams turned against the men. Sleep was shallow, interrupted by artillery or screams or the drip of water from leaking trench ceilings. But in those short hours, the men dreamt of mud. Not homes, not families, but mud. Dreams of sinking into it, of drowning in trenches, of crawling endlessly across cratered fields chased by invisible guns. Some awoke clawing at the ground, thinking they were still beneath fire. One corporal, an experienced soldier from Nottingham, was found crouching in a corner of his dugout, repeating over and over, "Don't let them walk behind me. Don't let them touch my back." No one ever knew what he meant. He was removed to a field hospital and never returned. His kit was divided among the platoon. His boots went to a 17-year-old private whose own had rotted through. The young man would be dead by the week's end. Command sent new officers. Young, clean, nervous. They arrived with plans and optimism and shiny boots. They tried to improve morale. New routines. Drills. Inspections. One lieutenant ordered his men to shave every morning. Within 3 days, he was found weeping by the latrine, his uniform soaked in trench water, begging for transfer. He was replaced by a man from Manchester who had lost 3 fingers to frostbite in the winter and said little, but made sure the rum was handed out without fail. The rum was everything now. Issued nightly. It burned like fire, but it numbed the brain. After enough, men could sleep. They could forget. It made the lice itch less. It dulled the noise of shells. Some hoarded their ration. Others traded it. A few gave it away, to comrades who'd lost brothers, to men who'd been digging graves all day. In some parts of the line, the war moved in strange ways. Shelling intensified without warning, only to cease just as suddenly. The Germans would fire for hours, then go quiet for days. British artillery responded in kind. Patrols ventured into no man's land, sometimes finding nothing but rats and ruined helmets. One night, a British patrol found a German corpse propped up with a note pinned to its chest. It read in rough English, "We wait too." The officers didn't know what to make of it. Neither did the men. They simply kept waiting, because that's what the Somme had become, a place to wait. For orders, for rotation, for death. The front no longer moved. The men no longer moved. Only the sky changed, and even it seemed tired of turning. The sunsets were muddy. The nights were smothered in fog. And every day, new men arrived to take the places of the dead. Some asked questions. Most did not. They saw the faces of those who had been there since the autumn. And in those faces, they saw the truth. There was no victory here. Only survival. For one more day. One more breath. June 1917 came to the Somme with warmth that felt almost cruel. The sun returned, first in weak flickers, then in full blaze over the tortured fields, but it brought no healing. The light only made the ugliness more visible. Where frost had hidden the rot, now it lay exposed. Bones jutted from the ground like forgotten tools. Stray boots with flesh still inside dried under open sky. Helmets rested atop sticks like macabre scarecrows, half buried in clay and crawling with flies. The stench, which had been masked by cold and wet for months, returned with a vengeance. Even veterans gagged in the trenches. Summer did not mean rest. It meant disease. Warmth reawakened every foul thing the Somme had buried. Dysentery spread through companies like fire in dry grass. Latrines overflowed. Drinking water turned dangerous. Every ration, every sip was suspect. Soldiers watched their comrades double over during sentry duty, vomiting or worse. Orders were clear, report symptoms immediately. But many stayed silent. A sick man could be pulled off the line, and that might sound merciful, but it also meant being replaced. And no one wanted to send another boy into this. Flies came in swarms. They blanketed the wounded. They covered food. They nested in wounds and eyes. A soldier with a bandaged arm could watch as the bandage itself writhed. Larvae festered in open cuts. Medical officers fought a losing battle. They had carbolic acid and creosote. They had gauze and iodine. But they didn't have enough hands. Not enough time. Not enough anything. And still the guns fired. Though the main thrust of the war had shifted north, the Somme remained hot. Shells fell every day. No great barrages, not like July of the year before, but enough to keep men alert, tense, and hollow-eyed. German artillery zeroed in on supply lines and rear depots. Horses were killed in droves. One ammunition wagon, hit just outside of Albert, exploded and burned for 3 hours, its crates of 18-pound shells igniting like fireworks. The road remained closed for 2 days, and the blackened bodies of the team drivers were only recovered on the 3rd. The British batteries responded in kind. The once quiet sections of the Somme, those held more for prestige or symbolism than tactics, erupted into violence again. Not for gains, not for position, but to remind the Germans, this place still burned. In the front lines, the rotation system began to fail. There weren't enough men. The expanding offensives in Flanders had drained the reserves. Companies meant to serve 4 days on the line stayed 6, then 8. Sleep became fragmented. Food became irregular. Discipline frayed, not from mutiny, but from fatigue so deep it stripped men of will. Orders were obeyed slowly. Helmets were left behind. Equipment rusted on belts. One morning, after a heavy night bombardment, a platoon was ordered to patrol the forward wire. Only 3 men rose. The rest lay still in the trench, awake but unmoving, staring at the sky. No one was punished. The sergeant simply took the 3 and went. He came back with 2. By June's 2nd week, new tactics appeared. German units began using silent shells, gas shells without explosion, dispersing in eerie clouds. The British had no warning system for these. Men woke coughing. Some never woke. The affected trenches were marked with chalk signs warning of contamination. Engineers arrived in full gear, masks on, gloves taped tight, to air out the dugouts. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the gas lingered in corners for days. In response, British command pushed for fresh air filtration systems. Mechanics arrived with crude fans powered by hand cranks. They were noisy, heavy, and mostly useless. But they gave the illusion of effort, so they were installed everywhere. Morale dipped again. Chaplains reported increased requests for confession. Not out of piety, but desperation. Soldiers wanted their sins absolved before they bled out in a shell hole. One chaplain, an Anglican from Surrey, began administering last rites to anyone who asked, Catholics, Jews, atheists. He said it didn't matter anymore. Behind the lines, reinforcements were drilled harder than ever. They ran trench obstacle courses built from sandbags and wire. They practiced grenade throws, bayonet charges, rifle cleaning under rain. But they couldn't train for the mud. They couldn't train for the smell. And when they finally reached the front, most stood in silence for hours, looking at the wreckage of what had once been villages. There were no signs, no trees, just crater fields and broken bricks. Some men broke quickly. One private from Kent, not yet 19, arrived at the line and within 2 hours was found sobbing at the base of the fire step, clutching a photograph. He couldn't speak. They carried him back to the aid post. He was never seen again. Others hardened faster. New NCOs were promoted from necessity. Authority was given to men who had been laborers, miners, clerks. They rose through blood, not favor. One such sergeant, a bricklayer from Glasgow, earned the respect of his platoon not through orders, but through silence. He fought in every trench raid, always went first over the top, never asked his men to do what he wouldn't. He survived only 3 weeks. Throughout the month, the rituals continued. Morning stand to. Tea, if there was any. Rum rations. Inspections. Letters. The dead were still buried in field graves, sometimes alone, sometimes 3 to a hole. Wooden crosses were carved with bayonets. Helmets nailed to stakes. The rain erased most of it by the week's end. But for a moment, each grave mattered. Command prepared again. More offensives were coming. The Somme, though quieter, would be drawn in once more. Support lines had to be reinforced. Ammunition dumps restocked. Field hospitals expanded. The war was not done with this place. Not by summer's end. Not by year's end. Not even close. And the men still waiting knew it. July 1917 arrived on the Somme with deceptive calm. The fields, though scarred beyond recognition, lay under open skies and sunlight. The great offensives of the previous year seemed distant, almost like myth. The guns no longer roared in ceaseless chorus, only in bursts at intervals like reminders. But beneath that uneasy quiet, the war still pulsed, alive in every trench, every crater, every whisper of movement across no man's land. The Somme had become less of a battle and more of a condition, a sickness that infected everything it touched. The trenches were no longer new. They had been repaired, collapsed, dug again, moved forward, and sometimes abandoned entirely. What remained was a warren, half-mapped, barely usable, a maze of half-flooded gullies and makeshift parapets. In many sectors, the original trench lines were gone altogether, replaced by shallow scrapes in the mud where men crouched for cover and called it a front. The communication lines were worse, tangled paths that twisted through shell craters and ruins, where a man could walk 10 minutes in the wrong direction and end up lost in a sector held by the enemy the month before. Patrols moved like ghosts. By July, night raids had become routine. They were not glorious assaults. They were silent, deliberate. Small groups, faces smeared in ash, bayonets wrapped in cloth to avoid shine. The goal wasn't always to kill. Sometimes it was to cut wire. Sometimes to map enemy positions. Sometimes to retrieve the body of a friend left too long in the open. But killing happened anyway. Always did. A single thrust of steel in the dark. A man strangled silently. A grenade tossed into a dugout where red lamps glowed faint behind hanging tarps. Then retreat, quick, through mud and wire and the hiss of shells fired blindly into the night in retaliation. For every successful raid, there were two that ended in disaster. Ambushes. Mines. Flare traps. In one notorious sector near Guillemont, a patrol of 12 went out. Only 2 returned, dragging a third between them with his leg hanging by threads. The rest were never found. Only their helmets surfaced days later, half buried in a crater's rim, circled by flies. Discipline remained a strange beast in this place. On paper, it was firm. Orders were obeyed. Weapons were cleaned. Sentries posted. But behind the order was a soft chaos, a slow unraveling. Men had stopped speaking full sentences. They communicated in nods, in muttered curses, in the shared look between those who had survived a shelling. Humor, when it appeared, was black and dry. A man losing a toe to trench foot might joke. One less for Fritz to aim at. A corpse half buried in a dugout might earn a nickname and a cigarette tucked between its teeth. The officers, those who remained, did what they could. Some enforced rules with zeal. Parade ground inspections in rear trenches. Kit checks. Marching drills. But most had adapted to survival. They led quietly, choosing their battles, reserving discipline for the essentials. Food, weapons, morale. The best officers were those who said little, who fought alongside their men, and who shared the same lice-infested dugouts and cold rations. The worst were obvious, and often didn't last. In July, the mud returned. It began with sudden rainstorms, violent, short, soaking everything in minutes. The ground, already weak, dissolved underfoot. Supply lines collapsed. Trenches turned to canals again. In one 3-day stretch, a single sector reported losing 40 rifles to mud. Men slipping, falling, weapons vanishing beneath the surface like coins in a pond. Artillery shells impacted with a wet thud, sometimes failing to explode, sometimes tossing geysers of filth that blinded everyone within a dozen yards. The animals fared no better. Mules collapsed and drowned in supply paths. Horses flailed in craters and snapped legs, screaming before the mercy shot. Rats feasted on everything. Some grew so bold they would chew at the edges of sleeping soldiers' tunics. Others died from gas or mud, their bloated bodies washing into dugouts where they drifted against boots until kicked away. And yet there was routine. That was the strangest part. Even amidst the filth and terror, a pattern persisted. Reveille. Roll call. Tea if there was time. Rum if there was reason. Work details. Ration parties. Stand to at dawn. Letters read again and again. Cigarettes lit with shaking hands. A brief game of cards. Sleep if it came. Then another day. In July, mail from home grew erratic. Some men received nothing for weeks. Others were handed bundles of 5 or 6 letters at once, some already wet, smudged, barely legible. One man received a letter informing him of his brother's death, 2 weeks after he himself had unknowingly carried the body back from no man's land. He read the letter silently, tore it into pieces, and said nothing for 2 days. Wounded men filled the aid posts. Not from major attacks, but from the steady drip of violence. Snipers, stray shells, misfired grenades collapsed trench walls. The stretcher-bearers moved constantly, red crosses painted on their sleeves, expressions blank with fatigue. They learned to recognize death at a glance. Who could wait? Who needed morphine? Who didn't need anything anymore? One surgeon near Montauban wrote in his journal that July brought more amputations than any month before. Not from trauma, but infection. "We are not surgeons," he wrote. "We are butchers. And even the butchers weep." Back home, the newspapers reported progress. The lines were advancing slowly. Enemy morale was breaking. German troops were pulling back in some sectors. Victory was possible. But the men at the Somme didn't read the papers. They had no belief in reports. They believed in mud, in silence, in the inevitability of another shell, another order, another attack. And those orders came. In late July, reconnaissance indicated new German positions forming near Delville Wood. High command wanted pressure maintained, enough to pin the enemy down, to keep their reserves from shifting north to Flanders. A demonstration in force was ordered. Not a full assault, just enough to show presence. 3 battalions were assigned. The objectives were unclear. The maps were outdated. The wire was uncut. But still, the plan was approved. The men went over the top at dawn, through mist, across ground they had crossed and bled on a year earlier. German guns opened up immediately. Machine guns swept the gaps between shell holes. The few tanks assigned bogged down within minutes. Artillery fell short. By noon, the men were back in their starting trenches, minus half their number. Command called it a probe. The survivors called it murder. The Somme, they now realized, would never be over. It would simply fade into new names, new offensives, new fields. But its ghosts would stay. And so would they. August 1917 descended on the Somme with a breathless weight. Hot, heavy, and without mercy. The battlefield, already a patchwork of ruin, now baked under an unrelenting sun that turned every trench into an oven and every crater into a boiling cauldron of stench. What water had not been absorbed into the clay turned fetid. Flies grew more numerous than bullets. Mosquitoes nested in the stagnant pools left by exploded shell holes. Men, accustomed to drowning in mud and choking on gas, now found themselves cooking slowly in the very soil that had once swallowed them. The days were long. Too long. Dawn came early, and with it the stand-to, the ritual of readiness in the uncertain gray. Helmets were strapped on. Bayonets fixed. Trenches manned in silence while the east lightened over broken ridgelines and shattered villages. There was rarely an attack, but it was expected. The Germans knew the ritual too, and sometimes they played along, lobbing shells or opening brief bursts of machine gun fire just to remind the men that this war, though stagnant, was not sleeping. Then came the day's work. Sandbagging collapsed trench walls, replacing duckboards, repairing wire, scavenging for usable scrap. Every hour in the sun stole energy like a slow poison. Uniforms became soaked with sweat, only to dry stiff with salt before evening. Lips cracked. Eyes stung. Men scratched constantly, not just from lice, but from their own skin rebelling against weeks of grime and sweat with no soap, no change of clothes, no clean water. And always the smell. It clung to everything, the reek of unwashed flesh, decaying corpses, latrines that overflowed every third day, and the oily musk of chemicals leaking from abandoned shells. In one sector, the heat grew so intense that a buried ammunition crate began to sweat nitroglycerin. It was evacuated and detonated in place, the blast setting fire to a nearby aid post tent. 3 were killed not by enemy action, but by their own volatile stockpile igniting under the heat. By August, discipline had frayed into routine rather than command. Officers issued orders, but they gave more warnings than threats. They knew that shouting at a man who hadn't slept in 3 days, who had watched his friend choke on gas, who now labored waist-deep in a latrine trench with a shovel and a rope, it served no purpose. So they issued the orders softly, and the men obeyed because it was easier than arguing. Mail came less often now. Supply lines were stretched thin due to ongoing operations near Ypres. When it did arrive, it brought both joy and sorrow. One private from Sussex received a parcel filled with homemade jam, wrapped in a child's drawing. He ate the jam in silence, then pinned the picture to the trench wall above his sleeping place with a nail. When the trench collapsed that night in a storm, killing 3, the picture was found in the mud, its colors bled into the soil. Storms, when they came, were biblical. Lightning cracked over open fields, illuminating the twisted corpses and shell-blasted trees like a scene from Revelation. Rain fell in sheets, washing away parapets, flooding dugouts, drowning the rats and bringing their bloated bodies into the bunks of sleeping men. Thunder masked the sounds of distant artillery. Some men were found dead with their weapons still in hand, convinced they were under attack. They had died of exhaustion, their bodies simply giving out. In these moments, faith was tested. Not religion, that had faded in the trenches long ago for most, but faith in anything: command, country, victory, even survival. Men muttered prayers they no longer believed. Some fashioned lucky charms from spent bullets, rosary beads, or pieces of shrapnel. Superstition bloomed. One unit believed that a particular corporal, having survived 3 direct shell hits, was cursed. They refused to stand near him. He was eventually transferred to another sector, where he was promptly killed by a sniper. The men said nothing. They simply nodded. Evenings brought temporary relief. The air cooled. The light dimmed. The rats stirred. With dusk came the rum ration, a thimble of fire swallowed without ceremony. And then, for a moment, the line went quiet. Not silent, never silent. The distant rumble of guns never ceased. But the immediate trench, the world within hearing, fell to a hush. Men smoked, wrote letters they wouldn't send, stared at the sky and tried to remember a time when stars meant peace and not artillery range. Sometimes music rose. Not from instruments, though here and there a harmonica or whistle survived, but from voices. A quiet tune hummed by one man, picked up by another, until a low murmur drifted through the trench like smoke. Old songs, home songs, hymns. Soldiers sang not for morale, but because it filled the silence that otherwise echoed with fear. They sang to forget, to endure. And yet, through all this, preparations for renewed action continued. British command, viewing the Somme as a secondary but critical sector, pushed for renewed raids to test enemy strength. Small-scale attacks were planned, night pushes, diversionary barrages, wire-cutting operations. Men were briefed in candlelit dugouts, maps drawn in chalk on tarps hung from sandbags. Objectives were meaningless, a copse of trees that no longer stood, a trench that no longer existed. But the orders came, and the men obeyed. One raid on August 19th became infamous. A company was sent forward under the cover of smoke. The wind changed. The smoke drifted back. Visibility vanished. Men became separated, panicked, opened fire on their own lines. When they retreated, only 13 returned. The rest were missing, presumed captured, presumed dead. The war diary entry read, "Minor action, no ground taken." Behind the lines, wounded men waited for transport. Ambulance wagons were delayed by shelling on the roads. Some sat for days under canvas tarps, moaning softly. The orderlies did what they could: tea, bandages, a dry cigarette, but they had no beds, no morphine, no relief. One young orderly from Dublin was caught in a shell blast while carrying water to a wounded officer. He lost both legs. The officer died anyway. The Somme in August was no longer about victory. It was about occupation, presence, holding a place simply because someone had died there to gain it. No one spoke of peace. Not seriously. Not yet. But in their silences, the men knew something had shifted. They were not winning. The Germans were not breaking. The world beyond the trench was still spinning, still writing about glory and strategy. But here, the truth was simpler. Every day survived was a victory, and every man standing was a monument,